Okay, sound okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, so here we are with what I'm calling small and beautiful. I started botanizing when I was, as she said, 16, back in Pennsylvania, in southeastern Pennsylvania, near Reading, Pennsylvania. And I found that was a tremendously good area to learn plants. And at that time, there were none of these popular books out with nice color pictures in. The only book I could find was something called Gray's Manual. And maybe none of you have ever heard of Gray's Manual, but it's a very technical book. It covers all the plants from southern North Carolina, west to the Mississippi, east to the Atlantic, and north into some parts of Canada. So the number of species is very, very large, and it is all in very technical language, so I had to learn new vocabulary to understand the book. And it turns out that that's the best way to learn from the beginning. Instead of looking at books and pictures, you do it the technical way, and then you're all set for no matter where you go. So anyway, I've also botanized in Mississippi. I was in the Air Force in Mississippi for 4 years, and I did a large amount of botanizing in Mississippi. And I've done some in the West as well, the Rocky Mountains and so on. And I came to Florida in 1999 and continued botanizing, and since I've been living here, I've been able to identify about, I think it's 1,272 species of plants. And in recent years, I've gotten into grasses, which are difficult. Sedges also, and rushes, as well as all the other plants, ferns, and so on. So anyway, we can get started here. I've made this a little bit more than just showing pictures. I make it a little more, say, educational as to how plants are grouped into categories according to their DNA, really, is what it amounts to. And one group is called vascular plants. And vascular plants have what are called vascular bundles. And one of the most important parts of it is a structure called the xylem, which is a bunch of actually more or less tubes that are in the plant stem, and they carry the water and nutrients from the soil up into the leaves at great heights, if necessary. And that mechanism is quite complicated. And then once the nutrients are up in there along with the water and sunlight, they produce sugars or glucose. And then there's another structure which takes this glucose and transports it back down the plant into the leaves and the stems and the roots for storage, as well as keeping those other parts of the plant alive. And that part is called the phloem. And they are found, these vascular plants are divided into 3 groups, known as pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. And you've probably heard of monocots and the dicots. They are the divisions of the angiosperms. And then there are things called cotyledons. And these are seed leaves. And you've probably seen them all if you grow plants from seed. When the seeds first germinate and come up,
generally speaking, you'll find 2 little leaves first, or maybe only 1 leaf. Anyway, if you see 2 little leaves, like with a tomato plant, those are called seed leaves. They wither up and die away, and then the true leaves develop later on. But anyway, this is important because this is a way of dividing plants into other groups, and it helps in identification. If you can recognize a monocot from a dicot, you've eliminated a lot of plants in the practice of identifying them. And now there are also non-vascular plants. They are honeworts, liverworts, mosses, and the green algae. The pteridophytes are, the group are ferns and the fern allies, and they reproduce by spores as opposed to seeds. And then there are gymnosperms. They include the cedars, cypress, pine, and the yew, and they reproduce by what are called naked seeds, and the leaves have just a single midvein. And all this is important because when you're trying to identify plants, if you can recognize these differences, you can eliminate many other species from your search. And with the monocots, monocotyledons, they reproduce by seeds, and their vascular bundles are only around the perimeter of the stem, such as, trees have a cambium layer around the circumference of the stem or the trunk. And these vascular bundles are found only in that very narrow ring called the cambium layer. And if you damage enough of that cambium layer, you kill the tree, because it can't take up water and nutrients, and it can't put the glucose materials back down to the roots for storage in the winter. Therefore, that's a disadvantage. However, there are dicotyledons, and they have their vascular bundles scattered throughout the stem, and this would be like palm trees. And this, now with the oh, I had that backwards. The dicotyledons are the ones that have the ring, and the monocots are, the monocots are scattered throughout the stem, and they're the palm trees. And this gives the tree a lot of flexibility. Palm trees can wave around and not break off very easily, whereas with the dicots, they have their vascular bundles only around their perimeter, and the cells that formed originally turn into hard wood, and that makes the tree rather stiff. And that means that can be broken rather readily, and they're not nearly as flexible as palm trees. I'm sorry about that mix-up. Oh, also what are called perianth parts. That's the calyx and corolla collectively. And in the monocots, those parts come in 3s or 6s. And in the dicotyledons, the perianth parts come in 4s and 5s. So again, if you can recognize all these things, you can eliminate many other species of plants. So all this is important when it comes to identifying plants. And here is the first one I chose. It's a little weed which probably everyone has seen growing somewhere. It'll grow in areas where grass doesn't grow too well, like here in Florida with our sandy soil. Sometimes the soil isn't very good, and it's kind of sort of a bare ground, more or less. And this is the kind of plant that will grow in that area. And it's a very common plant, but it has a very small flower. And on the lower right, you see the insert. That is, that little scale below are millimeters. So you see the seeds are a fraction of a millimeter in size, and the flowers are also quite small. The flowers are, well, you can see the seed, the top of the seed pod is above there, so the flowers are, well, maybe 2 millimeters or so in diameter, very small plant. But it's a common plant that if you stop and look, get down on your knees, you can see these little flowers. And well, this is just another picture, and it shows here how when the seeds ripen and ready to be expelled, the seed pod is called dehiscent. That is, it separates at a predetermined location, which is circumsessile around the pod, and that seed pod always breaks open in that manner, and that's called dehiscent. And the plants that don't break open at a predetermined spot, they are called indehiscent. And you can see the size of the seeds there. Now here's another little plant which, this one is not very common. This is the eringo. This is called the creeping eringo. And it has very small little flowers. And let's see, now I have notes here. This is, I only ever saw this at one location, and this is a place called the Chinsigut WEA Trail System. And in there is a big pine track trail and so on. And I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this place, but it's up in Hernando County. And it's an excellent place to go to see a lot of plants. And it's also a location along Florida, on the west coast of Florida. And there's a strip of land coming south from North Florida, coming down the west coast, gets down pretty close to Tampa. And the plants that grow in that area are very much like the plants that grow in North Florida. And I don't know why that is, maybe soil conditions or weather conditions or something, but it's a good place to go to see plants that otherwise you'd have to go to North Florida to see. And I found that a very interesting way of botanizing around the world to see how soil conditions and other conditions can determine what will grow there. And these flowers, of course, are rather tiny. They grow in that nice cluster. The eringo, there's another species, very common, but this one I've only ever seen in this one location. And that's the inflorescence of the eringo. Now here's a very interesting plant, which is in a family called Apocynaceae, which is also known as dogbane. I don't know, maybe it's true that dogs don't like this kind of plant, I don't know. But anyway, it's the dogbane family, and the milkweeds are found in this family. So this is really a milkweed, it has a milky sap. Now this one is a vine, and I found this growing in Wekiva River buffer. And I don't know, people up here in Orlando might well know of it. It's, let me see, it's off of the Wekiva Springs Road at Sable Point, if you know where that is. And it's part of the St. John's River Water Management District. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with these water districts, but they have areas set aside as areas surrounding their water supplies. They want to protect the areas around there so their water doesn't get highly polluted, and so that people don't build houses on it and all that. Because as soon as you start building houses on an area, the place is going to get contaminated by fertilizers, dogs and cats and all other kinds of things that get introduced to the area. And I find this an excellent place, and these areas are open to the public to walk their trails. All you have to do is find out where they're located. Anyway, this is a very interesting plant. It's related to the milkweeds. And you see that flower is a very unusual looking flower. It's not at all like most flowers that you see, but that's what makes botany very interesting, is the tremendous variety that nature has evolved over the many years. And here's a rare plant. I found this in North Florida. Let's see. I found this one in the Torilla State Park in Liberty County. And it's, according to Wonderland's book, it's a rare plant. I've only ever seen it there, and it was finished blooming when I found it, but off on the right there is a picture of the seed pod. And of course it's known as baby blue eyes for some reason. Now we skip to an entirely different kind of a plant. You've probably seen this a lot. It grows out a lot of time in the wet areas, but not always. These are known as the yellow-eyed grasses. And it looks something like a grass, perhaps, but it is actually a flowering plant. It is a little difficult to identify in that you have to tear it apart. In order to get into any of these things to identify them, you have to tear them apart. And when you get into small flowers like this, you require magnification. And so you have to kind of put this under a microscope, or at least a hand lens, and kind of tear it apart to get into the inner parts to see what's going on inside there. And then with the Wonderland's book on vascular plants, he has what are called keys in there. And these keys are binary keys, and they ask two questions. And you answer one, and then you pass on to it tells you where to go to the next binary. And then you answer again one of those. And then that tells you where to go to the next binary. And you keep on going from one binary to the other, and eventually you end up with the identification of the plant. And you don't have to have any pictures to do it. All you need is the proper vocabulary. And in these cases, you need magnification, and you need to understand how flowers are put together and all that. And you can identify the plant down to the species or variety. This one, of course, is the Richard's yellow-eyed grass. And there, after I tore off one of those scales, the taller part there is the scale, and on the inside is the ovary, where the ovary is where the plant egg or ovule is located, and that is fertilized and develops into a seed eventually. And now this one you probably recognize as the Spanish moss. Everyone will know that. But have you seen the flower of Spanish moss? A lot of people didn't know that it blooms, but it gets this little yellow flower. It's less than an inch long, and maybe about a ½ inch in diameter. And so it has this nice little flower that blooms in April. So sometime when you're out there in April, pull down a stem and take a look, and you might well see the flower. And it does develop a seed. That's a seed pod, and in there are some of the seeds are still in there, and they have little hairs on them, which means the wind can blow them around, and they're probably a little sticky, so they'll stick onto a branch somewhere. Anyway, that's one of our, of course, most common plants, and a rather small flower. Now here is a very small flower. Whoops, I didn't want to go there. This flower is up. You see that little flower up there? That's how small it is. This other picture in the top there is, of course, magnified quite a bit. But you see, it's a rather pretty small flower. And it's in a group, yeah, my memory goes on and off. It's in the spurge family. And anyway, this flower, see, you can find that green part is the female flower with these stigmas, little white stigmas, and that's the style that holds it into the flower. And the white and the reddish area are called glands. The glands are simply there for to look pretty, I guess you might say. They're like petals on a flower. They merely there as an attraction to bring maybe an insect in that would help to fertilize it. And down in here, you see some little red things around the center there. Those little red things are the male flowers. So in this case, the male and female flowers are separate in the same flower cluster. And it's just one of those unusual things. They're known as euphorbias. And you see this is Euphorbia polyphala. Polyphala would mean it's many, many leaves. And it's known as the lesser Florida spurge. I don't know where the name spurge comes from, but anyway, all of these Euphorbia type plants are in what's called the spurge family. And there you can see the more details of the flower. Okay, now here's another very common plant, as you can see, is the mistletoe. But did you realize that the male and female flowers are separate? They don't have the male and female parts all in one flower. Down in here you see are the female flowers, and they are more or less spherical. They're round, and they come on a stem with a cluster of these flowers. And eventually, when those female flowers are fertilized, they will form these seeds. And did you know these seeds are speckled? And now we go to the second one here, and you see the male flowers here. They are different. They're on different stems of the same plant. The same plant has both flowers, but they're on different branches. That's not uncommon. That happens frequently. Then we go to another very, very small flower, Paronychia baldwinii. Now I have a little blurb here about them. Paronychia, they are known as nailworts. Nailworts meaning like fingernails or toenails. And they're also known as whitlow plants. And this terms, in the Gray's Manual, it gave me this information. Whitlow is a Greek word for the disease called whitlow, and the disease is of the nails, namely a fungus disease. However, going back many, many years before people understood a lot about plants, they had no idea what was happening to their nails. All they knew is they were going bad on them. And and of course back in Europe many, many years ago, they would look for herbal plants to cure their problems. And there are plants which are now called Paronychia. They didn't have that name at that time. they called it nailwort because there are some species that have silvery, scaly parts on the plant. And they thought that if they rubbed their nails with this plant, it would cure them. Well, it turns out, of course, that was not the case. But anyway, that's how the plant got named nailwort. And the word, or the letters W-O-R-T, wort, means plant. So nail plant is really what that means. Or they also called the plant whitlow because of the ancient Greek name for the disease, So it's very interesting how names were applied, and I don't know who discovered all this, but anyway, Gray's manual gave me that information. Here is the Paronychia showing the small parts. The seed is in the upper left, and on the lower right there, I've put it in upside down. That's for some reason. But anyway, that is the fruit. The seed came out of that fruit. Here now is another it's a swamp plant. This grows in standing water. It's called the bog moss. And now the actual flower is these little white specks up here are the actual flower. They are very, very tiny. And if you're familiar with these other plants, these are dew flowers. They are introduced from, I assume, Europe. Anyway, I found this out in a development which the same people that developed Poinciana have developed this area. So I think these things are gone now. But it's the only place I've ever seen it, but apparently it's around quite a bit. The only thing is it blooms for a short time and it's easily missed, because you can look at that and say, that doesn't look like a flowering plant, it looks more like a moss. But it turns out it is a flowering plant and not a moss, even though the name moss is given to it. And there is a close-up of it. Now here's another one which you'll find it's called smilax or a greenbrier. The greenbriers you're familiar with, they're plants that many of them have very sharp thorns on them and a very tough stem. And if you try to tangle with them, you'll get the worst part of it. But this was the flower of the smilax. And this one is called the earleaf greenbrier. And I found this growing in on a fence in the Good Samaritan village, which is where I live, which is south of Kissimmee. And here is a close-up of the greenbrier flower. And it has, in this case, it has 3 calyx and 3 petals, which means it's a monocot. See, so right away I can break the identification of this plant down to a much smaller group than before by simply looking at it, and the parts are in 3s. So I know it's a monocot, and that is a big help in identification. And here is one of the polygolas, known as milkworts. This is a tiny plant that grows out in savanna areas that where it doesn't have too much competition. Now here's an interesting plant I find. This is in the genus Plantago, and it's called Wright's plantain. I don't know how many people are familiar with the plantains. There are several species. The most common one here is the Carolina plantain. And I was up in North Florida somewhere. I forget exactly where I was. Anyway, I stopped the car as I was driving along because I saw something I wanted to investigate. And when I got out there, I found that not only was that flower of interest that I saw from the car, but there were many, many other species of plants. So I probably spent several hours there just because there was just so many interesting things right at that one little spot. And this was one of them. And so I find that if you see something, sometimes stop and look, and oftentimes you'll find a lot of other interesting things as well. And you see these, they're very tiny flowers. I don't have anything to show Shy, except that's my finger in the background. So it's probably my index finger, so you see it's just a small part of my index finger. And here are close-ups. And again, there you can see my finger again. You can see how small those flowers are. But when you're down on your hands and knees, you can see them. And that's the way you botanize. Now, here is a very, very rare plant. There's only 3 places in the world that it's found. They're all in Florida, of course. And now, I didn't mention earlier, but I volunteer with the Rare Plant Project in Bok Tower, at Bok Tower. Cheryl Peterson heads that up, and I volunteer with that because they monitor rare plants within Florida. And I've been lucky enough to be able to see almost all of these rare plants that Florida contains. And it's been quite nice working with that group because now we have professional botanists there that really know what's going on in the world of botany. And you see this flower is quite small. It's a little purple flower there. The location of these plants are in Wonderland's book, or, well, not his book, but on his atlas. Wonderland and Hansen have an atlas, which is on the internet. And you can access this, and they have pictures of just about every flower or every species within Florida. And they also have pictures of their dried specimens in this atlas. And in this atlas, on the dried specimens, when it comes to the location of that plant, they mark it as obscured. They don't want people to know where these rare plants are found, exactly where they're found. They can tell you the county they're in, that kind of thing. But because otherwise they're concerned that people will come and dig them up and take them home, have a rare plant around their house. Well, for the most part, they're rare because they will grow only in very special places. So if you tried to transplant them, they wouldn't grow in your yard anyway. Now this one is rare because it cannot compete with other plants very well. So it does well where cattle are around, where cattle are trampling a lot and destroying a lot of their competition. And then these do very well under those locations. They also do very well along the edges of wet areas. So if we have a very wet spring, like in March now, if we have a very wet spring and the water is higher than normal, there may not be any of this plant growing this year. On the other hand, if we have a very dry March, the water is now further away from the location, you may not have any either. It needs just exactly the right location. And so in March, again, I'll be going out to monitor these plants. And we can see as many as 10,000 in a good year. In other years, we see 0. So I can't really tell you where I found this. And there you can see the size of the flower. It's very tiny. It's a bellflower. And well, if you've heard of chinsagut, maybe. I don't know if you have or not. But chinsagut is an area here. Let me see on my notes. There's a chinsagut Hill. It has an elevation of 269 feet, and it's in Hernando County. And two of the sites are in Hernando County, and there's another site. I'm not sure, it might be Polk County, but I'm not sure. Anyway, it's a very small flower, and very rare, just those 3 locations. And so I'll be going out again in the end of March and to monitor them. Here's the seed pod with the opening along the side of the pod where the seeds come out. And here is a picture of the seeds, which, as you can see on a millimeter scale, they're very tiny, just 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter in size. And they are actually triangular in shape, but they look sort of like a small football. So, but again, this is a very rare plant, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to see it and work with it to some extent. Now here's another plant which you'll probably have seen out there. It's this one's called Mailberry. I don't know exactly why they call it that. But anyway, it gets these small flowers. The flowers are probably maybe 1/8 of an inch in diameter or so. But the interesting thing about this plant is what's on the inside of that corolla. And there they are. These are the stamens, or the male part of that flower. And what do they look like? Well, who knows what they might look like. They look like dogs or something anyway. And at the very top you see there are little openings, and those are called apical pores, and there's where the pollen grains come out. The stamens, of course, are the male part of the flower, and the pollen grains come out of those apical pores, and they are then free to fertilize the female part of the flower. These stamens are attached to the inside of that corolla. And the corolla, as you can see, is, what would you call that shape? I'm not sure, urn-shaped. I think they refer to it as an urn-shaped. And take a very small insect to get in there and do the fertilization. Now here's another very interesting little plant. And I found this plant at the Wekiva Springs State Park along the boardwalk. I was out with the Audubon Society, and of course everyone else is a birder, but except I'm a birder too, but I look at plants as I go along. These birders are way up ahead of me, and I'm trailing on behind, and I looked down, and there I saw this tiny little plant growing in a wet place along the boardwalk. And this is the only time I've ever seen it, and I have no idea how long a plant. It doesn't have any leaves. The leaves are all small scales, but this is the entire plant. Everything you see there is that plant, and it's called a nodding nixie. So it's kind of thing, if you're careful and you look very carefully as you walk along, you might see something that's unusual like this. Now here's another very, very small plant called duckweed. A lot of people have seen it. It grows on the surface of water. So it's a floating plant. It's an aquatic plant, and it floats on the water. The picture here shows it as it's upside down, the way I show it. And it shows the roots which dangle down into the water. But the underside of the plant shows what are called daughter plants. The two, next marker there. Yeah, see, the daughter plant there is one right there, and over here is another daughter plant. The plant very rarely ever blooms. It doesn't produce seeds, but very, very rarely. And so its reproduction is done entirely by budding. The daughter plants simply bud off of a mother plant. And as the daughter plants grow, they eventually separate and become a whole new plant by itself. The duckweeds are quite common. They cover the entire surface of a pond or lake. And the flowers are since they bloom very rarely, they're known as the smallest flower in the world. Here I borrowed a picture from the internet, because since they bloom very rarely, I've never seen the blossom. But it's a very, very tiny flower and very rudimentary. It has only the essential parts of the flower that needed to reproduce itself. And over here, well, in the white area, it's hard to see the red dot in the white area. But anyway, here, this little part here is the female part, and the other two parts are the male parts. There are no petals, no calyx, none of the other parts of the flower that you normally see, but it does bloom occasionally, and I'd like to be able to find it sometime, but you probably have to look at 1 million specimens before you find it. Here's another plant growing over in the Chinsagut area, known as the purple sneezeweed. And this is in what used to be called the composite family. Now it's known as the aster family. And it was called the composite family because it's not a flower. This is not a flower. This is a composite of many flowers. And this shows it. If we look at the inside of this flower cluster here, you see the inside here is the receptacle. And all these other things are attached to the receptacle. And each one of these little projections out here is an individual flower. So there could be how many in this head? This inflorescence, there could be 100, I don't know, maybe more, individual flowers. And so a lot of people don't even try to identify the asters in the aster family because there's so many of them and they find them difficult. Again, well, part of the difficulty is the flowers are small and you have to really work quite hard to get to the inside of them. This is a flower here, an individual flower from the inside of the flower, and this one down below here is only around the edge of the flower, and this is called a ray flower. And when many people look at these aster flowers, they think of it as a flower with petals around it. Well, those what look like petals around it are really the ray flowers. They are an individual flower by itself, and they're called ray flowers. And the ones in the very center are the disc flowers. They're on the disc or the receptacle. And you can see the size of them. Each of the flowers they're maybe 5-6 millimeters long, but in diameter they're only maybe a little over 1 millimeter in diameter. And if you want to get inside of this, if you want to get inside of that flower, I need to put it under the microscope, and I use a needle point and tweezers, and I tear it apart. Then I can see what's on the inside of the flower, and that's what is necessary to identify it. You have to look at the stamens and the female parts, and eventually, I think, and the dandelion. Most of you are familiar with the dandelion and how the white things float around as carrying the seeds around. Well, they have a little bit of that around there, and these are the plants that have that little white material which acts like a parachute, which will allow the plant to be blown around and carry the seed great distances. So anyway, that's what is called the composite family, or now known as the aster family, and it's the largest plant family, largest number of species in it, and it's the most recently evolved part of the plant family, of the vascular plants. Now we get into much more, say, difficult plants. These look like grasses, but in this case it's not a grass. It's known as a sedge. Sedges generally have triangular stems. Some of them are not so triangular, but many of them are very triangular stems. But there is the seed of that plant. And in order to identify these, you most have to need a microscope in order to see them, because there, as you can see, the seed, in this case, it's fairly long, but the seed itself is the brown part, and the other part is the tubercle, or it's a beak, or tubercle, and down below are bristles, which grow from the base of the seed. And this is what they when you look at it under the microscope, under a fairly high power level, this is what the seed looks like. You see all the fine detail in there, and this is the what is known as the horned beak sedge, or short bristle. The bristles are these other. These are the bristles, and these bristles are fairly short. Sometimes they're very long, and sometimes they're actually absent. But anyway, this shows the beauty that nature has developed, all the fine detail that one gets into. And here shows other seeds, or they're known as achenes. Here shows one kind here with the bristles. Here's a kind without any bristles, and here's another without any bristles, and here's one with longer bristles, and they're all different shapes. Here's some more shapes, and you see, in order to identify this plant, you more or less need to find it when it's mature enough to have these achenes present so you can identify them. If you just look at the leaves alone, I would not be able to identify them. Now we're getting into grasses. Grasses are much more difficult. There's such a large number of them. The flowers are tiny, as you can see up here. These are the flowers, the flowers are actually on the inside of these envelopes here. There's an entire vocabulary of parts of the grass flower, and it's different from the other flowers. And in order to get inside of them and look at them, again with the needle point and the tweezers, it takes a lot of time. And again, this is a picture of the spikelet, which is the flower is actually on the inside of there. Now this gets into another grass type looking plant. This looks like a grass, but it's not. In this case, it's known as a rush. It's an entirely different kind of a flowering plant. And I see there is a close-up of the cluster of many little flowers. And here it shows the mature seed pod, and the seeds are, you see, they're very, very tiny, a fraction of a millimeter in size. And all this is done with a microscope, and a lot of time. And of course, a lot of these pictures are taken through the microscope, not with a regular camera. But I have a digital camera on the microscope. Now here's another plant, which we're getting into plants now that propagate by spores. This one is known as Louisiana spike moss. These tall stems here with these small leaves on it is the spike moss. The red dot isn't showing up there. Anyway, I found this up in a place called the Goethe State Forest. I don't know if you ever heard of that or not, but it's way up in Levy County. So when I get around, drive up to Levy County in one day, botanize and drive back again. That's a long day. But anyway, I was just, what I do is I just simply stop the car along the road, and then I start looking around, and I just stumbled upon this patch of spike moss. And then under high magnification, you see here the reproductive parts. This is this yellowish kind of thing right here. It's this little thing right in here. That's the megasporophyll, and the little brown areas are the microsporophyll. So this is magnified quite a bit, and that's the way the plant develops its spores and the way it reproduces. And you can see this size of those parts are rather small. And here is something called the horsetail. Now this particular species doesn't really look like a horsetail. There is a species that does look more or less like a horsetail. This one is simply along every plant is just one tall stem, about 3 foot tall, and the picture there on the left shows the plant, the top of the plant, where the very top part there with my forefinger shows where the spores are developed, and the other spots below there, the purplish or darker areas, are the leaves. In this case, in the horsetails, the leaves are reduced to scales, and it just has that whorl of leaves that are scale in size, every so many inches separated. And I found this over in, I forget which county I found this in, but this is over somewhere around the Green Swamp area. And that's an excellent botanizing area. And here's another one of the spike mosses. This is known as a nodding club moss. And in this case, the fertile part, the part that reproduces, is nodding on the end of the branches. And here is a true fern. Doesn't look much like a fern, as you know it, but this one is called the whisk fern. This is found in Osceola County. The school district has a place near Point Siena where they take the kids on field trips to show them something about nature. And this is along the boardwalk in that area. And it's called the whisk fern because it looks something like a whisk broom, I guess. And over here are those little knobby things are the reproductive organs where the spores are developed. So it's just, in this case, a brief review of all the many different plants that have small parts to them for reproduction. And this is my last slide, and I hope that you might have learned something.